In the bloody theatre of the European witch hunts, the so-called Devil's Mark emerged as one of the most damning and grotesque pieces of alleged evidence. Historically, it was believed that those who made pacts with the devil would bear his signature somewhere on their bodies, a blemish ranging from an ordinary mole or scar to a supposedly insensitive patch of skin that would not bleed when pricked. This physical proof could be anything at all, which made the devil's mark less an objective reality and more an elastic concept that could be stretched to fit the needs of the accusers. The devil's mark played a critical role in witch trials, where it acted as a fabricated certainty in a world desperate for scapegoats. Inquisitors, often under pressure to produce confessions, used the search for bodily signs as a justification for brutal interrogation, torture, and execution. Within the broader culture of fear that dominated the late medieval and early modern periods, the devil's mark became a mirror for the collective anxieties of society, a physical manifestation of the invisible dangers that people were taught to fear but could not easily define. Ultimately, the devil's mark was never a mystical phenomenon in any true sense. It was a tool, a weapon forged from superstition, religious extremism, and the deep-rooted human tendency to project internal fears onto external realities. It reveals more about the machinery of social control and the psychological projection than it ever does about sorcery, Satan, or magic. Its history serves as a stark warning about how easily fear can be given flesh and how brutally a society can act once it believes it has found an enemy it can see and touch. The roots of the so-called Devil's Mark run far deeper than the witch panics of early modern Europe. Long before Christianity had tightened its hold over Europe, bodily marks were interpreted through the lens of superstition and folk belief. In many pre-Christian traditions, unusual physical features, such as moles, birthmarks, scars, or deformities, were seen as signs of divine favor or curses, depending on the context. Some cultures revered these marks as evidence of spirit ancestry, magical inheritance, or otherworldly connection. Others regarded them with superstition, interpreting them as tokens of bad luck, omens, or physical proof of spiritual corruption. As Christianity spread across Europe, older folk ideas about bodily signs did not vanish. They were simply reinterpreted through a new, harsher theological framework. Physical irregularities, once perhaps seen as mystical or ambiguous, became increasingly demonized. The church, obsessed with purity, both spiritual and physical, began to view the body itself as a battlefield between God and Satan. This shift laid the psychological groundwork for the later obsession with finding the devil's signature inscribed upon the flesh of supposed witches. It was during the European witch hunts between the 15th and 17th centuries that the concept of the devil's mark underwent its most grotesque and violent transformation. Theologians, jurists, and witch hunters developed a perverse codex of physical signs that allegedly proved a person's allegiance to Satan. The idea was that when a witch pledged themselves to the devil, he would mark their body as a sign of the unholy pact. These marks were said to be insensitive to pain and immune to bleeding, leading to the barbaric practice of witch pricking, which was stabbing suspects with needles or bodkins to test for insensate flesh. A birthmark, a skin tag, a mole, or even a patch of dry skin could be sufficient grounds for torture and execution. Theologians like Jean Baudin and Heinrich Kramer, authors of grim manuals like Demonomanie des Sorcières and Malleus Maleficarum, respectively, reinforced the necessity of bodily evidence. Their writings argued that because witches served Satan in secret, God permitted their guilt to be revealed through physical signs. Popular culture followed suit, feeding a lurid imagination. Pamphlets, sermons, plays, and ballads all echoed the warning that the devil's servants walked among ordinary folk, branded and yet hidden. Fear bled into fascination, and suspicion into paranoia. In truth, the devil's mark had little to do with faith or evidence. It was a fantasy born from the collision of theological dogma and the deep-seated superstition, weaponized by courts desperate for confessions and by communities eager to root out imagined threats. The body, so long viewed as a vessel of sin, became a canvas upon which terror could be painted, and in the panic that gripped towns and villages, it was all too easy to turn an ordinary body into evidence of an extraordinary crime. The evolution of the devil's mark from a vague folkloric idea into a formal instrument of accusation demonstrates a brutal reality. Societies under pressure will twist even the most innocuous traits into reasons for persecution. The marks themselves never changed, only the stories told about them did. The definition of the devil's mark was as fluid and opportunistic as the witch trials themselves. It could be almost anything: a mole, a birthmark, a scar, a freckle, a patch of dry or discolored skin. In an era where medical understanding was rudimentary at best, any natural imperfection could be reinterpreted as a sinister brand. What mattered was not the nature of the mark itself, but the will to find it, and the terrifying consequences once it was discovered. Central to this process was the widespread belief that the devil's mark was a place on the witch's body that had been rendered insensitive to pain. This idea birthed one of the more grotesque rituals of witch hunting, the practice of pricking. Witchfinders and their assistants, many of them little more than professional sadists, would strip suspected witches naked and systematically stab them with needles, bodkins, or specialized pricking tools. If a patch of skin failed to bleed or react to pain, it was taken as irrefutable proof of guilt. In reality, the body under conditions of extreme cold, fear, or physical exhaustion can experience temporary numbness. But such mundane explanations had no place in trials where the verdict was predetermined. It is well documented that some witch prickers employed retractable needles, ensuring that certain tests would produce no blood and no pain, no matter how healthy the skin. In other words, evidence was not just misinterpreted, it was often deliberately manufactured. The physical violation of the body became a public spectacle, a ritual humiliation that stripped away dignity as well as life. This grotesque theatre served not to uncover hidden truths, but to confirm the superstitions that the community already believed. Compounding the confusion was the conflation of the devil's mark with the so-called witch's teat. Popular lore insisted that witches nourished their demonic familiars, spirits or small demons, with their own blood or milk. Thus, any unusual nipple-like growth, skin tag, or even an extra fold of skin could be described as a witch's teat. These imagined anomalies added yet another layer of vulnerability. Older women, whose bodies naturally bore more growths, wrinkles, and blemishes, became easy prey. Again, normal human variation was twisted into monstrous evidence. The search for the devil's mark was never about genuine inquiry. It was a brutal farce designed to justify foregone conclusions. What mattered was that some physical abnormality could be pointed to, something to satisfy the baying crowds, reassure the fearful, and allow the machinery of accusation and execution to grind forward without interruption. In the end, the devil's mark could be found wherever the inquisitor wished it to appear. It existed not on the body itself, but in the mind of the accuser, conjured by fear, hatred, and the intoxicating righteousness of moral panic. Flesh became fiction, and from that fiction, thousands of innocent people met the noose or the flames. In the absence of reliable testimony or objective evidence, the devil's mark became a judicial crutch, a crude but potent symbol of guilt during the witch trials that swept across Europe and colonial America. When a confession could not be extracted, or when accusation alone was not deemed sufficient, the discovery of a mark was enough to tip the scales toward conviction. It offered the illusion of physical proof in a theatre of moral panic, where the desire to punish often overrode any interest in truth. Confessions, when they did occur, were usually extracted under duress, through sleep deprivation, torture, threats, and psychological manipulation. But when those methods failed, or when additional corroboration was demanded, the devil's mark filled the gap. For inquisitors and judges, it offered a tidy solution, a simple, tangible justification for execution. If a mark could be pointed to, no matter how ordinary, it became the smoking gun. The accused had signed their soul over to the devil, and the body bore the receipt. This strategy served not only judicial convenience, but also religious ideology. The presence of the mark was framed as divine justice, a sign permitted by God to unmask the devil's servants. The church and state reinforced one another. Theology provided the framework, and the courts supplied the violence. Witch hunting manuals and legal treatises laid out the process in grim detail, advising magistrates on how to locate and interpret marks as evidence of diabolical pacts. And once a mark had been found or invented, few accused individuals escaped the scaffold. But the damage did not stop at the trials themselves. The concept of the devil's mark penetrated deep into the psyche of the people. In a climate where neighbor could accuse neighbor and a birthmark might mean death, paranoia became epidemic. Individuals began examining their own bodies in fear, scanning their skin for anything that might invite suspicion. A mole, a freckle, an unexplained blemish all became cause for anxiety. Some attempted to remove such marks by cutting or burning themselves, hoping to destroy what they feared others would see. Others resorted to secrecy and concealment, covering parts of their bodies and avoiding communal bathing or undressing in public spaces. The terror was internal as much as external. People began to doubt themselves, to question whether some dormant evil might lurk within, waiting to be revealed. The devil's mark was not just a mechanism of persecution, it was a psychological trap, turning the body into a site of suspicion. The accused were often caught in a web they could not escape. If they denied the charges, they were obstinate and proud. If they confessed, they were damned. And in both cases, the presence of the mark sealed their fate. The devil's mark thus functioned as both a tool and a terror, a way for institutions to kill with legitimacy, and a way for society to devour its own. It is a brutal reminder of how easily fear can be made flesh, and how the body, once made political, becomes a battlefield no one wins. The devil's mark was not merely a judicial convenience or theological curiosity. It was a potent cultural weapon, serving broader societal purposes with chilling efficiency. At its core, it functioned to reinforce dominant systems of power, the authority of the church, the rigidity of religious orthodoxy, and the stranglehold of patriarchal control. By tying the body to guilt and sin, it offered a visible excuse to regulate, punish, and ultimately eliminate those who existed outside acceptable norms. Religious institutions capitalized on the concept of the devil's mark to tighten their grip over population. In an age where salvation was presented as conditional upon obedience, the idea that sin could physically manifest on the body allowed the church to position itself as the gatekeeper of both spiritual and corporeal purity. The priesthood, inquisitors, and local judges became arbiters not just of faith, but of the body itself. Those with unclean marks, real or imagined, were cast out, punished, and destroyed. This wasn't simply about rooting out witches, it was about policing conformity. Those who deviated from the social order could be branded, literally or figuratively, and disposed of under divine sanction. The devil's mark also became a projection surface for deeper psychological tensions. Medieval and early modern Europe was a culture steeped in repression of sexuality, of bodily autonomy, of spiritual doubt. The body, especially the female body, was viewed with suspicion, a site of temptation, decay, and corruption. The mark offered a convenient vessel for those unspoken fears. It externalized guilt. Instead of confronting internal contradictions about sex, power, or suffering, society projected them outward onto the skin of scapegoats. Nowhere was this more evident than in the gendered nature of the accusations. Women were overwhelmingly the targets of witch hunts, and the devil's mark was a key part of that gendered violence. The search for such marks often centered around intimate areas, under breasts, around the genitals, the inner thigh. These invasive inspections were acts of domination as much as investigation, rituals and humiliation cloaked in legal or religious justification. The female body was portrayed as more corruptible, more suspect, and more likely to be in league with Satan. In truth, women were simply more vulnerable, economically, socially, and politically. The devil's mark made that vulnerability visible, then weaponized it. The elderly, disabled, and socially marginalized suffered similarly. A hunchback, a missing limb, a strange birthmark. Any deviation from physical normativity could be interpreted as a sign of infernal influence. In a time before medical explanations were accessible or widely understood, difference became danger. Those already on the edges of society were easy to isolate and easier still to destroy. The devil's mark gave permission to turn suspicion into execution. In this way, the devil's mark was never about evidence, it was about control. It marked not just individuals, but boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable, holy and unholy, male and female, powerful and powerless. And like all boundaries rooted in fear, it demanded blood to maintain itself. Though the age of witch trials has passed, the devil's mark has not disappeared. It lives on in modern culture, sometimes as fiction, sometimes as reappropriation, and sometimes as a disturbing echo of the same psychological and societal mechanisms that once fueled mass persecution. What was once used to condemn and execute is now repurposed, reframed, and in some cases, uncomfortably revived. In popular media, the devil's mark has become a staple of the horror genre. Films, television series, and novels frequently portray witches as physically marked by their allegiance to dark forces, their bodies branded with sigils, strange blemishes, or occult tattoos. Those depictions rely on old tropes, reinforcing the idea that evil leaves a visible trace. While often sensationalized, these images echo the same anxieties that drove the witch hunts, the fear that hidden corruption can manifest visibly, and that evil walks among us disguised as ordinary flesh. Even when framed as fiction, the core belief remains potent that danger can be read on the body if we only know how to look. Within modern witchcraft and neo-paganism, however, some have deliberately reappropriated the concept. Rather than reject the symbol outright, practitioners often reclaim it as a badge of defiance. Marking the body with tattoos, ritual scars, or symbolic imagery becomes a way to subvert historical oppression, to wear proudly what once would have been cause for death. In this context, the devil's mark is stripped of its moral panic and reimagined as a sign of power, lineage, or spiritual awakening. What once signified condemnation is now used to assert agency and identity. Psychologically and anthropologically, the devil's mark is understood today as a scapegoating mechanism, an external sign onto which the society projects internal fears. Carl Jung might call it a manifestation of the shadow, the dark, unacknowledged aspects of the self projected onto others. Anthropologists have noted similar patterns across cultures. Those who deviate from social norms are often marked, literally or figuratively, as threats, whether it's a bodily defect, a ritual scar, or simply being other. Societies use visible difference as a way to justify exclusion and violence. This same pattern resurfaces in modern conspiracy theories. Though the language has changed, the logic remains the same. Fringe movements speak of secret symbols, body modifications, or marks that allegedly identify members of hidden cabals. Claims that echo the medieval obsession with finding the devil's mark on witches. Social media has only amplified this paranoia, where doctored images and baseless accusations are shared virally, turning ordinary people into targets. The demand for visible evidence of invisible crimes has not disappeared. It has merely adapted to the tools and fears of the digital age. The devil's mark, then, is not confined to history. It lingers in the cultural imagination because the forces that created it, fear, control, the hunger for certainty in chaotic times, are still with us. It reminds us that the human desire to find evil written on the skin rather than face it in the mirror remains a dangerous impulse, one we are not yet free from. The Devil's Mark, far from being a relic of supernatural history, stands as a stark reflection of human psychology and the mechanism or the mechanics of social control. It reveals not truth about the occult, but uncomfortable realities about how societies respond to fear, difference, and the unknown. Beneath the religious rhetoric and violent ritual, the Devil's Mark functioned as a projection, a physical scapegoat onto which communities offloaded their anxieties about sin, sex, illness, and disobedience. It allowed authority figures to enforce conformity under the guise of divine justice and gave neighbors permission to persecute each other under the illusion of moral duty. By examining the Devil's Mark, we do not uncover proof of witchcraft or satanic pacts. What we uncover is the architecture of accusation, how belief becomes weapon, how bodies become battlegrounds, and how the need for certainty can spiral into cruelty. Its use throughout history reminds us that once fear is legitimized by authority and ritualized through culture, it gains momentum. It becomes self reinforcing, immune to reason, and devastating in consequence. Even now, long after the fires of the witch trials have burned out, the same dynamic persists. Today, we may not call it the devil's mark, but the urge to single out, mark, and scapegoat others remains deeply embedded in our social fabric. To see it in the moral panics that erupt around identity, appearance, or belief, in conspiracy theories that demand visible signs of hidden evil, in online mobs that seek digital stoning instead of legal justice. The symbols may have changed from moles to hashtags, from skin to metadata, but the psychology remains eerily familiar. Understanding the legacy of the witch's mark is more than historical exercise. It is a mirror, and if we are brave enough to look into it, we might recognize that the true danger was never the mark itself, but the eyes that sought it and the hands that punished it. All right, so that's today's little show, and thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed that, and cheers for now. Bye bye.